Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and to our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. I'll remind our Internet viewers that questions or comments can be sent to us at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. For those in-house, if you'll be so kind to make that last courtesy check that your cell phones are off, it is always appreciated by our speakers. And we, of course, will post the program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference as well. Hosting our discussion this afternoon is Stephen Bucci. Mr. Bucci is director of our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy. He previously served as a senior research fellow for Defense and Homeland Security here. Dr. Bucci also served for 3 decades as an Army Special Forces officer and top Pentagon official. He is well-versed in special operations, cybersecurity, and defense support to civilian authorities. He served as military assistant to Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld for 5.5 years. Upon retirement from the Army, he continued at the Pentagon as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Homeland Defense, and America's Security Affairs. Immediately prior to joining us here, Dr. Bucci was a lead consultant to IBM on cybersecurity. He also serves as an adjunct professor of leadership at George Mason University. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Steve Bucci. Steve?
Well, let me add my welcome to everyone here. This is a subject that's sort of near and dear to my heart. As a Special Forces officer, we focused a lot on terrorism and countering terrorism in my career. We have a rare treat today. I would add that on September 12th, 2001, there weren't that many people in America who were asking the question of, should we be fighting terrorism? Because the decision had sort of been made for us. It's been quite a while since then, for some of us longer than others. But today, there are lots of people asking questions, sort of the nature of a democracy as we approach conflict. The questions of who should we be fighting, why should we be fighting them, how should we address this threat, how long are we going to have to put up with it. Chris Harman has attempted in this book to answer some of those questions. I think it's timely. He does it in a way that, and this is not a criticism, this is actually a compliment, he does it in a way that does not obfuscate the questions and their answers with lots of academic window dressing. So he writes it in a way that is easily understandable by all of us, normal American citizens, and I hope that will be read by lots of those normal American citizens who live and work in that funny round-shaped building up the hill from Heritage, up there on the Capitol, because they really need to understand these things. Chris is the Matthew C. Horner Chair of Military Theory at the Marine Corps University. He is speaking today as an independent scholar and is not representing the Marine Corps. He is the author of, so far, 5 books related to terrorism. 2 editions of the book Terrorism Today, which is a graduate-level textbook used by many of the military schools, in particular around DOD. He has another one in the works, he tells me, that he's working on. He also has a relationship back to Heritage. We always like to talk about our alumni. And that he originally, in 2004, wrote a backgrounder. This is our somewhat longer pieces that we publish here at Heritage, that was called How Al-Qaeda May End. It was published in May of 2004 and was really one of the first publications post 9/11 to think about what the heck is going to happen to Al-Qaeda. I can tell you what I was thinking, I was hoping would happen to Al-Qaeda in 2004, and it hasn't happened yet. So I am going to stop there, taking up time, and ask you to join me in welcoming Chris Harman as he discusses with us his book, A Citizen's Guide to Terrorism and Counterterrorism, and then when he's done, I'll come back up to moderate the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you for coming on such a chilly day, and I'm delighted to present perhaps 25 or 30 minutes of comments and look forward to interaction with you then on the questions you have. I'm also very glad to see Jim Phillips here. I've worked on terrorism issues with Jim for, it must be a quarter century now, and there are very few people in the world who write with the intelligence and prudence that Jim Phillips does. Here's a couple of reasons why I wanted to write the book, so I'll start this way with the way terrorism encounters the citizen. I remember back in 1980 reading some clippings in newspapers. It was in the Chicago area, and a woman was looking out her window near her home, and she saw a van pull up. And in that van, there proved to be some 9 different people, and they looked rather like an athletics team. You know, the jogging uniforms and the bags. But as she looked out her window, this lady, Mrs. Walter Jacobson, decided that she should be a little nervous about this. There had been some robberies in the area by the FALN, who are Puerto Rican separatists, and she noticed a few things that were odd to her. First of all, these athletic bags sure seemed much heavier than she was used to seeing with athletes. And secondly, some of the guys were smoking. So she decided this wasn't a workout at all, and she thought for a minute, and she called the police, and in effect she interrupted an armed robbery that was plotted by 9 members of the FALN with 2 others nearby. And there was a cache of weapons and a sawed-off shotgun and all that, and these all went to jail, these people. Although, oddly enough, at the end of his tenure, President Clinton pardoned a bunch of them. One of the policemen who was there at the time said, just trying to be cheery, that they all felt lucky that day. And one of the others, a newspaper reporter, wrote that this happened during a routine traffic stop. And both of those accounts are really incorrect. It was really Mrs. Walter Jacobson. I've been unable to even find her first name, a completely obscure case now, but she broke an attempted robbery of the greatest importance by hardened terrorists who all went to jail thanks to her intervention. So you know that phrase now. It started in New York, and it's now kind of a nationwide push by Department of Homeland Security that if you see something, say something. I like the phrase, and I think it captures well the sense that we as citizens have both a duty and opportunity to be citizens in cases that do touch on civic security. I like the slogan more than I do some which have more emphasis. For example, you'll often see signs around military bases that say, if you see anything that looks at all suspicious, immediately report to authority X or Y. I would think it's better, really, for the public to think a little bit, to contemplate a little bit, to ask themselves what they're seeing and not to jump to any conclusions too quickly. But I like the notion of this sort of responsiveness among citizens. I do think that, by and large, citizens have some understanding that they are involved in some ways. And I wrote in part to tell the book, to tell the stories of some citizens who've been involved and in good ways. In the spirit of Mrs. Jacobson, for example, there was another person who was part of the Lackawanna community in New York. And no one ever has reported who this person is, although there's a good book on the case. The person suspected, in watching some of the Yemeni men who'd come back in mid-2001, a portentous time, from overseas, she felt that they were up to some bad things. And she wrote in somewhat troubled English to authorities and said they ought to look into this half-dozen young men who had come back, because this person who wrote seemed to feel that those men were a sort of threat to the Yemeni community. And he or she was absolutely right, and authorities did look into it. And those people had not only been abroad to Southwest Asia, most of them had been in a camp run by Afghanis and Osama bin Laden, and they were there for training. Now, I found another kind of category besides these persons who act privately and quietly. And another sort of group that we have among us is those who really have tremendous physical courage and may not be looking for trouble, but seem to show the right attitude and response when the alarm bell sounds. If we think back to 9/11, it is astonishing the way those men charged down the aisle of the United Airlines flight over Pennsylvania. They knew from cell phone traffic what had happened in New York City when they did that. And they were sort of, minute men for our day, except the analogy fails, really, doesn't it, from Concord and Lexington commonalities, because they didn't have muskets, but they were willing to charge. And we think that that's pretty unusual, and it is, especially in airplane situations. For decades, the counsel from authorities was always the same. Stay very calm, stay uninvolved, don't make eye contact, do what they tell you. But these people, knowing what they did on that day, made a different decision, and it was very heroic. And it wasn't freakish in the sense that since then, 2001 and 2009, we've had passengers subdue other terrorists, Richard Reed and Farouk al-Mullatab. And both of them had clothing treated with explosive material, you'll remember, and hoped to blow up the planes. Now, my favorite, actually, man on the spot is a woman, and that's Uli Derrickson. And this does go back a ways, but you may remember her a little bit. She was Central European. She was an American citizen, 40 years old. It was her fate to be the lead stewardess on TWA 847 on that flight. So Shiite thugs had attacked the plane, taken people hostage. They were working a kind of perverse psychological approach to break down the passengers. Whipsaw everybody into confusion and submission. Well, Uli Derrickson was frightened, naturally. Who wouldn't be? But gradually her composure returned, and she began thinking about what she could do to moderate this impossible situation. So, for example, it emerged that she spoke German, and some of the hijackers did as well, and that became the only common language, actually, that all the parties had. And she intervened, sometimes psychologically, sometimes physically. They once asked her to sing German songs to them, believe it or not, in the long, long drama of this hijacking, and she did so. Very strange. Well, she and the pilot, John Testrake, both showed amazing courage in the TWA 847 hijacking. Remarkable. I suppose we all admire this kind of thing. We wonder whether we'd ever be up to it ourselves. These people on the day proved themselves up to the level of events, and extraordinary persons. The third category I found to look at is sort of more predictable, the tried and true professional. The person's trained to do the kind of intervention that sometimes happens, and it's not very often. But they are involved. We saw someone shot at Los Angeles Airport not too long ago. Not everybody in the business of security, private or public, might be top of the line. Some might seem to us as airline passengers a little bit disengaged, or someone might be very good, but only in 5 years will they really know all their trade. But otherwise, we meet in public life many people who are involved in the security business who prove themselves very capable. They rise to the moment. Maybe it takes you back too far, but in 1988, a remarkable occasion in New Jersey is one of the things that makes the book for a paragraph or two. A trooper named Robert Saplinski took notice of a driver, as they are trained to do, and he pulled him over for a moving violation, but he saw through the windows that there were materials on the back seat which he distrusted. And so quickly a simple traffic stop turned into an arrest. The man he caught that day was a man named Kikamura Yu. Kikamura Yu is a member of the Japanese Red Army, which had trained with Libyans and many other international terrorists. And he was there on his way to New York to hit a Navy recruiting station. And this was going to be the 2-year anniversary of the bombing of Libya in 1986. And it was only Saplinsky's intervention then that saved that recruiting station from being bombed by Kikamura-U. 1995, you may remember that Timothy McVeigh came very close to escape over a state line after bombing the Oklahoma City building. He was caught by a Oklahoma highway patrolman named Charles Hanger. Hanger noticed that simplest of things, that he didn't have proper plates on his vehicle. And he noticed it when they were passing like this on a highway at a very high speed. So he swung around and he stopped McVeigh. He was a trained patrolman. So rather quickly he assessed that a slight bulge within the jacket of McVeigh suggested a pistol. And so they had a little talk about that. And the terrorist said that my sidearm is loaded. And the patrolman said, so is mine. And after a brief standoff, the terrorist got into his car and dutifully rode back to the station. And then Hanger didn't stop there. While the man was inside, Hanger returned to his vehicle because long training had taught him that many times the suspect tries to divest themselves of material, which you can learn a lot from. So he looked in his own car, and sure enough, he found a little business card. And it said Paulson's Military Supply Company. And on the back, it said TNT at $5 a stick, need more. And so that was helpful, and no one at the time, of course, knew what McVeigh had just done in Oklahoma City. They were only learning about it, and they never thought to connect him to it. One other case, 99, right, the famous millennium period when the country had sort of tremors about what would come with the year 2000. Diana Dean, a customs inspector up in Washington State, found somebody coming over the border. Her training made her suspect him. He got nervous after too many questions, bolted from the car, and Diana Dean probably saved Los Angeles International Airport from a bomb that Abdul Rassam was intending to deliver. The book also includes a story, and it's a long one. It's been nicely told in a magazine story, but about John O'Neill. We all look back to wondering about those who, before 9/11, actually connected all the dots. And FBI's John O'Neill was one man who did so. Remarkable, well-trained, thoughtful. For years, he had believed that al-Qaeda was coming back to his city. He knew about 1993. He suspected another attack would come on those buildings. He did everything he could to move the FBI along towards recognizing the threat. He did liaison with other agencies, with the White House, with overseas guests. John O'Neill was the kind of Cassandra. He really knew it was coming, and he kept warning of it. Eventually, he got discouraged, and he retired from the FBI, and he took a new job. He took a job as head of security in the World Trade Center in New York City. And so he turned up for work there in August of 2001, and he kept that job only for a few days. And he was on scene when it all happened, and he died in the rubble. So that kind of citizen is one reason I wanted to write the book. Another one is a very different reason. I wanted to write this short book to talk about the way we do have a grand strategy in our fight against terrorism. I don't think a lot of Americans know that, or they don't see all the pieces. And I tried to lay some of those out to help the citizen reader kind of develop a fuller perspective on what public business is done by all parts in this drama. In that respect, then, a couple of assumptions. The book starts with the idea that terrorism is a very real thing, a definable thing, and a bad thing. And actually, in the academy, those aren't all accepted propositions. I use a definition from a think tank. This is not mine, but it's always guided my scholarship, that terrorism is the deliberate and systematic murder, maiming, and menacing of the innocent to inspire fear for political ends. The character, the terrorist threat that we face, is explored in the book, and certainly it starts with al-Qaeda, but then is also broadened enough to bring in many of the other hostile political and religious groups that we see. It's a premise of the book that we are, in fact, at war with core al-Qaeda. Now, we can find quotations from the White House saying that they agree with that, but I would argue that in the last year there has been some doubt on the question of whether we're at war with core al-Qaeda. I argue that we are and that we ought to be. And I think it's a bad thing that it's become an open question of just how long this fight will occur for reasons I'll get into. Now, the central part of the book tries to look at our strategy. What are the components of it? How does it work? I suppose the White House and the National Security Council will always have that central coordinating role in making all the agencies work together if they can, and all the bureaucracies respond if they can. And it's not easy. So the sort of candid account in the book of how hard it is to do this, no matter what party's in office or who's in charge. So you might have, for example, Commerce Department in the business of promoting exports very reasonably. We would want them to do that. And yet there could be tension with the Treasury Department, which might be very eager to put sanctions on a particular business, a particular powerful individual, maybe a state sponsor of terrorism like Iran at a time when it's not convenient with respect to diplomatic initiatives. Our intelligence agencies certainly differ legitimately. They can quarrel about assessments and priorities. There's a fine new book called Treasury's War by Juan Zarate, who has a lot of experience in this, and he brings up one case in which intelligence is closely watching a whole terror network someplace, but at the same time they have to have a meeting with justice because justice is eager to wrap these fellows up and make arrests, and they have to, one or the other has to stand down. Certainly state and DOD have their differences, and those are famous. I think for citizens, we don't see always how many overseas personnel we have that are not military or not CIA. So, for example, the Drug Enforcement Agency has a remarkable international network, which is very active, very smart people. They go through many of the same fine schools in the States that other experts in security do. And the FBI, you would know, has some legations overseas as well and deploys on a spot basis, an ad hoc basis, to a lot of crime scenes. And they are extremely important. So there's some stationed overseas and many who go there overseas in a contingency. Even the New York City Police Department, to go back to New York for a minute, has a remarkable intelligence organization that probably was contested initially by folks like FBI and CIA. But they felt that if the federal government wasn't going to defend them very well, that after 9/11 they needed to set up their own defense. And so they put tentacles out and listening devices out, and they're trying to keep pulse on parts of the world which they think are dangerous. And they do this through all the appropriate proper channels, but they're trying to watch the world before the world comes again to New York in a way that they don't like. So the NSC, if they're doing well, will sort of moderate some of these turf problems when they're federal. The book has then several page groups on each of the major elements of our strategy. So diplomacy, public diplomacy, economic tools, law enforcement, the military. Diplomacy is probably a good place to start. We know terrorism is very political. We know it's usually international. Diplomacy, therefore, has some prospects. And diplomacy's done well in some cases. In multilateral diplomacy, I think most folks regard the Irish settlement, which took from, maybe 1997 onward till 2007, that was an impressive product from multilateral diplomacy involving a lot of Irish and British players, but a lot of outsiders, including some Americans, like Mr. Clinton, like George Mitchell, a lot of others from around the world. Bilateral also has some successes. Bilateral diplomacy I'll mention in a minute with respect to the Libya problem, where we worked with the United Kingdom on that. But I also, in the book, draw some cautionary notes Because in going to conferences, as you do, and sort of listening to the discussion and watching the way, quote, talking to terrorists has now become one of the hottest fields in my own business in terrorism, I have a lot of reservations about the way in which diplomacy can succeed, just how far it can go. So I'm more reserved in that respect, but I look at, for example, some of the false negotiator stories, of which there are some. One is the Abu Abbas back in the famous Achille Lauro case where an American was murdered. He basically sent the gunman in to do the dirty work and then positioned himself vis-a-vis resident governments as a kind of intermediary who could step in and be helpful. There was an absolute classic by Colonel Gaddafi, one of his last cases, I find, of deliberate export of international terrorism. About 99-2000, there was a crisis with Abu Sayyaf taking multiple hostages, foreign hostages. So out of the Philippines, this group acts. Gaddafi then steps in a grandiose way as a mediator, and he offers a fantastic amount of money. 20 million is what's referenced by a Filipino diplomat who did a book on this. And this is to sort of still the waters, solve the crisis, and everything else. And it was marvelous because he'd helped Abu Sayyaf before. He's now given him $20 million, thank you. But he also emerges as the classic diplomat then, which was good for the image he was seeking back in 2000. It was highly skillful stuff. So there's a lot to be wary about in diplomacy, of course, and there's not always an easy payoff. A lot of groups like, say, the LTTE Tigers went for decades with many attempts at intervention, which all failed, and they had to be simply crushed. Economics is an important tool. You know, we know, everybody, every college graduate knows that if you're going to do economic sanctions, it's important to have as many people in the mix as you can, and also to hold them with some patience for some time, because sanctions take a long time to work. But you know, sometimes they do work. I'll bet you, if you think about it, most of you will think that sanctions had some role in the resolution of South Africa with its apartheid regime. Certainly, my studies made me believe that Libyan behavior was changed by sanctions. It was changed some in the 1990s, and it was dramatically changed in about 2003 and 4. Some of the people are right here in town who did this. An intelligence man, Steve Kappas, and Ambassador Robert Joseph, they worked with the United Kingdom to press the Libyan authorities to get them to divest themselves of WMD, not only the supplies, but the actual machinery. The machinery, this is kind of a prelude to what you're seeing with Syria, the machinery for making that WMD was put on a ship and brought to the United States. It was a wonderful resolution of a very long-standing problem with the Gaddafi regime, and that was facilitated by intelligence and diplomats from two different countries, and it's extremely a good story. Well, I go then into the questions of the strategy, so I need to mention a few of these. Mr. Bush then writes the first national counterterrorist strategy that we have, right? And he actually did 2 of them, and his principles were defeat the terrorists and their organizations, deny them sponsorship and sanctuary, diminish the underlying conditions that terrorists exploit, and defend the U.S. at home. His government did a superb job of that. He got himself a very broad congressional authorization, which is now, I'm sorry to say, being prematurely questioned. He argues in his strategy that terrorists are truly evil. He's not afraid to say so. In fact, he says they are enemies of humanity, which is an old term in international law that sort of compares them to pirates or people who do genocide. He had a strategy of attacking the core of al-Qaeda, but also what his advisor Dave Kilcullen called disarticulation, whereby the links between the groups are broken up if need be. And I suppose assessing that would require clearances that I certainly don't have. The Obama administration enters the fight and actually surprises many of us, I think, probably you too, with remarkable continuity in some of the actual practices. Because rhetorically, he had suggested it was going to be pretty different. But in fact, more similarities than differences appear. Certainly his strategy, published in 2011, has less martial language. Certainly there's less of a conviction that this is a war. He does call for help from allies, which is prudent. He does say he's going to try to get at the roots of terrorism, something that's exceedingly hard to do. I wonder how Jim Phillips would assess getting at the roots of terrorism in the Middle East. I wonder how anybody with whatever level of expertise could imagine really solving those problems rather than just managing or dealing with them. But he tries to get at the roots. Mr. Bush had thought, we can do this best if we advance democracy, because democracy is a great prophylactic against terrorism. And that's a proposition which is by and large true, I think, but also has some difficulties, because we've seen many, many open societies which have wonderfully open political orders, but which are ravaged by terrorism. So it's not the full answer, but it may well be a part of a good answer. There's a bit of a paradox there. So I'm not sure that either Mr. Bush or Mr. Obama can tell us exactly how to deal with the roots of terrorism, but I suppose we all want to try. Mr. Obama said we need to do a lot more with allies and a little bit less on the go-alone approach. A marked rhetorical difference. I have no problem with that. Our international efforts are exceedingly important. They're at the very heart of trying to counter terrorism. In moral terms, he says less about the evil in terrorism and much more warnings to us about evil in our own practices. In other words, in counterterrorism, have we crossed the line in places and ways that are troubling? And he's especially worried about the conduct of torture. Again, I have no problem with that. I think we should all oppose torture. In terms of other things, he calls for a, quote, effective, durable legal framework for CT operations. Great idea, but I don't know if we've seen this yet. I don't think we have a durable and legal framework that our citizens understand, or even counterterrorism experts understand. I think that seems clear. So all the fuss, for example, about closing Guantanamo, I would say, is related to this failure to have an appropriate legal strategy. I could offer some comments, but the short of it is that I think when James Cole and Eric Holder and others were talking about this in old campaigning days, it seemed easy to criticize Guantanamo. But once in office, they've found, for a variety of reasons, that they actually find Guantanamo quite useful for managing the legal odd problem of the detainees that we have, who are neither pure criminals nor people in uniform who we would treat purely through military means. We could talk about that a bit if you like. The basic point I want to argue, and I think that the administration's a bit soft on, is the question of whether we're at war. We're repeatedly seeing now, starting with the May 23 speech at National Defense University, suggestions that the war should end, the war will end, that we're withdrawing from the war, that nobody, of course, wants perpetual war, and of course, that's right. And so there's some ambiguities that I think have been entered into the conversation, which right now are simply unhelpful. Because Al-Qaeda still thinks it's at war. I certainly think we're still at war. There's parts of the executive branch, the military and all, who very much think they're at war. And I think going back to the question of legal strategy, some of the conundrums we've made for ourselves about detention, about surveillance, are resolved if you consider that we are, in fact, still in a state of war with Al-Qaeda Central. Some of those problems get quite clear. We have a great deal of rights as a belligerent against this sub-state organization, which we can exercise in that respect. Last thing I want to say is there is, of course, a leader of the opposition. It's a strange thing that our president almost never mentions Ayman al-Zawahiri, but I think he should. The document that's published by the White House, June 2011, explicitly says in two places, not just one, that Osama bin Laden is the only leader that Al-Qaeda ever had. And since he'd just been killed, that's an extremely important and interesting statement. But it's only about half true. Bin Laden had, as a deputy, from the very beginning in the 80s all through the 90s, this man, Egyptian Ayman al-Zawahiri. When the Atlantic Monthly published a bunch of stuff right off the hard drive of al-Zawahiri from a camp in Afghanistan, we could see that he was functioning as the deputy. Everyone assumed he would take over. Most people did when bin Laden died, and he did so. And the oaths of allegiance, the bayat, are made by these subsidiary groups now to Ayman al-Zawahiri. So he may not have quite all the flash or organizational abilities, and he may even be less of a leader, but he is the leader, and he's important. And he's been a leader for decades in terrorism, and he's been one of the leaders in al-Qaeda for decades too. So I think it's important to keep a fix on him. In short, my assessment in the book is there's some things the president's doing very well. His opportunities and his job difficulties are both enormous. I think he's done well to impose sanctions on Iran. I hope we stick with those and not give them up. I'm glad he's identified the Revolutionary Guards, in fact, as part of the problem. I'm glad that he's pursued the drone war with its remarkable fusion of intelligence and defense assets, and I approve of that, and I think the president's very smart to keep pushing on that. There are some other things that we're perhaps not doing so well with, and the book makes a few modest recommendations. In short, I think that what we're looking at is a long war. It's a long war. It's just what the Heritage Foundation said it was going to be many years ago. It's not a perpetual war, and nobody wants it. It's not necessary to have a perpetual war, but it is a long war. And certainly until the leader of al-Qaeda core, Ayman al-Zawahiri, is either caught or captured, then I suggest we're still in a state of war, and we ought to be. Stephen?
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. I would ask you to raise your hand. I will recognize you. One of our folks will give you a microphone. Identify yourself briefly, and then please ask a question. All right, if I don't hear a question mark at the end of the second sentence, I'll ask you to stop, because if you want to give a presentation here, see me afterwards. We'll arrange for it, but we got Chris Harmon for today. All right, and the lady right here.
Hi, my name is Saba Ahmed. I'm a law student at American University. My question is in regards to this long war that you referred to. I would like to get your comments about what would you say to the people who say that we've been losing the war for the last 13 years, and if we continue down this path, we are never going to win. Even if you capture one or two people, the al-Qaeda threat that you have formulated is apparently appearing everywhere around the world. And I'd like your comments on specifically about the losing the war. Thank you.
Sure. I don't think there's much evidence that we're losing the war. So you're right, there's probably some who say so, but I disagree. The way I assess this organization, and the way I did when I spoke here in May of '04 and talked about the long-term problem, was to think of al-Qaeda as having two centers of gravity. If you know that phrase from Karl von Clausewitz, don't be worried, because he actually does, in his analysis, allow for more than one center of gravity. We as analysts are hopefully able to narrow it to one, but sometimes we can't. One center of gravity is the core operational capability, which he led, which Ayman al-Zawahiri has always led, starting with especially the formal merger of al-Jihad with al-Qaeda in mid-2001 before the attacks. And all those sort of third operatives and personnel who very often are been caught and are in custody or in Guantanamo or in jails in Afghanistan and so forth. And hundreds of those involved have been caught. Many of them are the most talented or had direct roles in planning and executing operations. All of those people's the catching of those is all a sort of victory. But moreover, the international community is sort of alert and capturing some of those when they come through their territory. And so I think that part of it's impressive. The other side of it, though, is, as you suggest, the recreation of others, the raising up of new terrorists. This isn't anything about religion necessarily, although that is central to their ideology. But if we look at, phases of the Red Brigades in Italy, or the Irish Republican Army. There's always a process of regeneration. We need to somehow get at that. On that account, I think we're doing very badly. I don't know that we're losing, but we're not making headway. And what bothers me is good people like Helly Dale right here have been talking about public diplomacy for years, but we're actually not showing the kind of new arguments, imagination, determination that we need to make that succeed. So in that way, we've made very little progress. And I don't think this administration is going to do any better than the last one did on the side of public diplomacy.
Get this gentleman, and then we'll get you next.
Thanks. Mike Kraft, I was at State Counterterrorism Office for many years, done some writing since then. And I'm wondering, Chris, in your strategy area, you talk about various things. You don't, on a quick skimming, you don't seem to mention some of the non-sexy programs like the training we give other countries, in countering terrorism, building up their capabilities, or countering terrorism financing, which all take a lot of money. You mentioned the budget's been cut since the Bush administration and since then. What do you see as the role of these training and non-kinetic programs, and any theories as to why it's so hard to get funding levels sustained by Congress?
Yeah. Michael, thank you. You were careful to say that on the skim you hadn't seen that, but I think on a close reading you'll see it. You'll be happy to know there's a section in the what we can do on strategy that says something like our partners can catch terrorists too, because I think you're right. And in fact, I know how you spent your career at State, and the interesting thing is when we look at the Drug Enforcement Agency, we look at Defense Intelligence Agency, we look at so many parts of our operating forces, our military forces. Many of them are involved with these liaisons abroad, which are not understood by the public. So, for example, 5 academies around the world are law enforcement training academies. And you'll get this wonderful joint combination of the fellow from the Bureau and the fellow from DEA and somebody from Treasury that's an expert on terrorist finance and someone from Special Forces and maybe some international perspectives. And in places like Bangkok, these things run all the time. Budapest, Bangkok, there are 5 of these. And those are very important because they say, with bricks and mortar and a long procession of speakers, they say year after year, our allies count, our partners count. We're working this internationally. We're creating an international network, a CT, just like the terrorists have an international network themselves. So, my last job in Europe, ending in 10, was with a program that's now had 1,400 graduates from all over the world, all professionals in counterterrorism. So the U.S., in that case, the Germans and the U.S., make tremendous investments in this respect, and I'm very optimistic about the yield in some of this.
Okay. Lady right here.
Thank you. My name is Leandra Bernstein with EIR, Executive Intelligence Review, and this is a 2-part question at getting at what you said about the roots of terrorism, and the overarching question for the 2 is what is your view of following the money? For example, Representatives Walter Jones from North Carolina and Stephen Lynch of Massachusetts co-sponsored a House resolution to declassify the 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission report, which in their review of the pages, they said reviewed the foreign financing for the 9/11 attacks and points to Saudi Arabia. The second part of the question is your view of auditing certain banks, for example, HSBC, other banks that have been known to be taking part in the financing of terrorist groups in violation of money laundering laws and also in violation of anti-terrorism laws. The HSBC case was just the most recent study done by Carl Levin in the Senate.
Okay.
So what's your view on
Sure.
following the money?
And it's a good question, especially as it was part of Mr. Kraft's, too. I completely agree with the current federal effort to try to get at the sources of terrorist financing. And boy, is that hard to do. I never say things like, money is the lifeblood of terrorism, or that with cutting off the money supplies we can strangle terrorism. I think that's a gross overstatement, and politicians should never say that. It's like being elected in a mayor's job in a big city and saying, I'm going to absolutely end crime, and if you come back in 2 years, you're going to want to reelect me because we wouldn't believe it, nor should we. Terrorism is important. It's one of the things that you have to in terrorism, you have to have some money. But it doesn't take much to do something like happened in, say, the Westgate Mall attack in Kenya recently. Something like that can be quite cheap. So-called lone wolf terrorism can be a long, elaborate process for 10 years, as it was for Andrews Breivik, or it could be a very quick, simple, ugly thing, like one man with a couple of machetes outside a British Army base in London a couple months back. That's cheap terrorism. So it's never going to be the essence of it, but it is part of a grand strategy. Second point is that sometimes the forensics value is fantastic. You know how the Bali bombing was solved? This was an incredible thing, a double bombing where they bombed a bar to drive people out into a public square, and that's where the major bomb was waiting. And the damage looks like the Luftwaffe had just hit the city. Okay, and the way that was broken was through financial forensics. So at some point, some of the money came into an ATM, and to disperse the money, these fools all went down there together. So they're all looking into the picture, waiting for their share. And so by simply finding one ATM slip, authorities were able to get right to the bottom of the case. It's never usually that easy, but it was in that case, and Selena Rialiu has nicely documented that. She's here at National Defense University. So there's a lot of reasons why it's worth it. We should just never overblow the payoff. It's just part of our grand strategy. It's rarely going to work as easily as it did in breaking the Bali case.
And Chris said I could chip in now and then if I wanted to. I have to tell you, as a former Special Forces officer, I was greatly heartened the first time I went to one of U.S. Special Operations Command's global synchronization conferences at the amount of focus they put on the terrorist financing aspects of it and how it could lead to other operations and stopping those things from going on. It is an enormous part of the national effort. So I would never discount how much of that we're doing. They're paying attention. They might not put it out to the general public, but there's a lot of effort all the way across the U.S. government and in conjunction with our allies. It's a major track of our counterterrorism effort.
And there have been a couple of poor books on that, but this newest thing by Juan Zarate, Treasury's War, is really a very fine piece of work, and we can all learn a lot from looking at the way he's addressed this problem.
Okay. All right. Young lady right here, and then the gentleman in the back.
Hi, Rebecca Buckheit. I'm here at the Heritage Foundation. Dr. Harmon, you talked about public diplomacy and the fact that it seems that we really aren't doing it so much. And I was wondering if you could give some examples of perhaps if there are any of public diplomacy efforts that are working in counterterrorism, as well as some efforts that we should be implementing.
Yes, the opportunities are wide open. Some of them we explored during the Cold War. So good congressmen who many of you would know, like Jack Kemp and Jim Corder, exported the ideas, in a way, of American democracy by doing things, by supporting international broadcasting, other work at the U.S. Information Agency. I was in Warsaw for the first time in my life, and I was able to buy an old yellow copy of Solidarity, which we openly added to funding to during that crisis back in the 80s. And it was very exciting to watch the way in which that funny little organization came out of nowhere and had such an amazing effect. Of course, the Pope's another case of having an amazing effect, and that was just as important as the political side. These things can have effect. People like Andrei Solzhenitsyn and others who've come out of the Soviet Union say that we are absolutely ignorant and blind to the good effects we ourselves were having, that we didn't realize the kind of thunder this created over there. In a world deprived of information, what little we could provide was greatly important. Well, I think we've mostly forgotten that. And it's too bad. And we've not only broken down the United States Information Agency, we've tried to then build up some structure. So the new public diplomacy team seem to always have a pretty good budget. I think it's something like $800 million now, which is about half our total public diplomacy budget, $800 million for broadcasting and such, perhaps. And we have a new television station that's aimed at the Arabic speakers, for example, based right here in Springfield. We have a new effort by the last Secretary of State to get some things going on social media, which is probably wise. But in fact, we have so far an elaborate attention to technology, to budget, to media. And you know what the problem is? We don't know what to say. We don't know what to say. We're embarrassed by many of the ideals that were the thrill of our founders. We're not really sure how to frame the arguments. We don't want to attack the Salafi jihadists who call themselves that because somehow we think we're going to use the wrong words and we're going to alienate Muslims. We fail frequently to give airtime or to amplify the speech and argument of some very fine critics of the terrorists themselves who were on the inside. The Egyptian who helped raise bin Laden, many people at places like the Quilliam Foundation who quit Hizb ut-Tahrir. The defectors are very valuable. It's folks like this who we could really work with and use more, and we don't do that. We really have a poverty of imagination on the public diplomacy side.
Yeah. All right, gentleman in the back, then I have one that's from the web.
Chris, do you think the IRA
Get-
and BASC
Can you talk into the microphone, please?
Do you think the IRA and the BASC terrorists have gone away as a long-term problem?
Right. It's a good question of whether groups ever sort of end. And sometimes they seem to, and they just change their name. I had hoped, for example, that the successful rendition of Abdullah Öcalan in 1999 had quieted forever the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party. And I was sort of half wrong. I mean, we got 5 years of peace in that theater, which I think was welcome to the Turks and other Kurds who weren't PKK terrorists. But in fact, they managed, after name changes and other kinds of work, to sort of creep back. With the Irish Republican Army, we've seen an incredible breakthrough. When you have people like Martin McGuinness and Jerry Adams taking senior posts, or in Adams' case now, he's actually an MP in Eire in the Southern Republic. When you have people like that get out of the fight, advise others to get out of the fight, you've had a real ground changer, and that's exciting. But there are remnants. Some are older, and some are very young, and they think the guys like Adams and are pacifiers, appeasers. But I don't think that the Irish case will blow up again. And with respect to ETA, I've argued in Orbis a couple years ago, that organization's dying. And that's not a small thing. It's founded at the end of the 1950s. It's been an attempt to make insurgency. It's always had political and terrorist dimensions of it. But right now, there's hundreds of those people in jail in Spain and in France. And moreover, they've published a rejection of violence as not the way to go. The Spanish have also compromised them by encouraging Pacific Basque nationalism while roughly opposing the terrorists with law enforcement, with proscription of their political fronts. And so you've got actually a great success story by a couple democracies here with the Irish and the Spanish. There are ways to do this. It's not balanced towards military things. It's usually, as much as anything, law enforcement. It involves persistence. It involves leadership. It involves clinging to the higher ideals of democratic politics and refusing to let terrorism be an alternative to democratic politics. And the leaders in Spain have done that. The leaders in Old Italy did that too. So there are some good success stories.
Okay, and we have one from our group watching on live video, and this is from Adam Johnson, and he says, "The speaker implies we are still at war. Actually, I thought you said we were still at war. But if al-Qaeda is religiously inspired and we're still fighting them, wouldn't we be therefore in a religiously inspired war carried out by military means?
Carried out by terrorism means, not military. Most states in the world have forces that have guns, and they're not terrorists just because of that. A lot of terrorists, by the way, might wear some parts of uniform or do certain things that seem like they would wish to be a state, but they don't make the cut, the simple cuts defined by Geneva so long ago of 4 tests for whether you're a legitimate belligerent. I think that it's true that the al-Qaeda guys are definitely inspired by religion. We, of course, make an obvious distinction between that faith, which is Islam, and the extreme versions of it, which are at the heart of al-Qaeda. But it's valuable for us to face those religious roots of the problem. And in fact, one of the best ways to do that is to simply open an edition of Inspire magazine. And they'll tell you how they're inspired. So there have been 10 or 11 of these so far. Even after the editors were killed in a drone strike, there have been subsequent issues. And that lays out in very clear terms how they do their public diplomacy and how they hold to their religious beliefs and how they're willing to fight and die for them. And so they are religiously inspired. Our war is not. We got to remember, as Americans, we fought with the anarchists a century ago plus, and we defeated them by a long process of law enforcement, attrition, and other things. We have resisted for years guys like the KKK, who have very different motivations, and there have been waves of KKK, and they're still with us, but they've never been able to affect their real purposes. We attacked the communist terrorists within this country, groups like the Weathermen, groups like the Symbionese Liberation Army. These groups have all been beaten. In the 80s, the FBI and others infiltrated the right wing, the militias, and they locked these guys up in jail, and they did it with great skill. So we've beaten many waves of terrorism that have nothing to do with religion. And so it isn't that we have some kind of obsession with religion in this war, it's we have an obsession with al-Qaeda, which is an organized and hostile entity that's attacked us repeatedly.
Okay, all right. Still have your question? Okay, you right there.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question regarding public diplomacy. In Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, they place a high priority on counter-ideology, focusing on radicalization and de-radicalization programs. Would you say that in the toolkit that the U.S. has right now that those are areas to further explore, or that we're doing that quite well? Thank you.
Thank you, and I don't think we're doing it well. The Dutch are way ahead of us. The British are way ahead of us. We've tried in this way. The Marshall Center has held many meetings on this and brought people together from around the world to try to decide how to do it better. I know in Germany they do that. I think that it's very difficult to change people's ideas, and I think that you have to have people that have the right arguments and sometimes the right qualifications. So in an audience that I've seen, there's nothing quite as powerful as a member of one of those organizations that has quit. In the past, with some of our wars, we can take an example from this, whether it's the first war in the Philippines at the turn of the century, or the war against the Haq Balahab that ended with Louis Turuk's surrender in the mid-1950s. In both cases, the commander of the opposition in our custody wrote books and went on, gave lecture tours and such. I mean, and they actually talked about the prospects for the Philippines being a partner of the Americans without being subservient. It was incredible public diplomacy. And they have a kind of credibility that no professor from University X or Y can have. And I think that's a good example of how we can do far better. In terms of de-radicalization, again, some successes by Saudis, Yemenis, and some other countries, but also some losses. Recidivism's a problem in prisons. It's a problem in terrorism too. So you never are absolutely certain that you've changed the man's views. There are some very good cases, and the Saudis especially have worked very hard on this because they are stung by the fact that many of the dollars in al-Qaeda came from various monies, usually private in Saudi Arabia and other places, And they want to fight back, and they also got stung by Al-Qaeda allies like Saudi Hezbollah and such, or people in the not formally allied, but terrorist groups have stung the Saudis, and they're trying to overcome the direct personal threat too. So this work can be part of a grand strategy, and it's one of the many areas in which we Americans have much to learn from our partners. They're sometimes ahead of us, and there's a lot more we can learn on that.
Okay, I'm going to exercise the moderator's prerogative here and ask the last question, and I'll let you answer it and then take it wherever you want to do your wrap-up, and we'll conclude. And I'm going to steal this actually from your intro. Americans are very performance-oriented. We like to, let's finish this thing, be done, walk away, move on to the next event. Will we ever be able to say that we've defeated terrorism?
I don't think so. The method and the idea of it is introduced into international politics in a couple periods, including in the anarchist period I mentioned, which is fascinating and which is useful to study because of the certain similarities with flat organizations and internationalism and such. The years of 1880 and 1900 are not all lost on us as we think about this, but I don't think that, especially since 1968, it's likely to say that we won't see terrorism. Unfortunately, it works in many respects. It often works tactically. It often works operationally, and sometimes it even works strategically. I mean, we all know the National Liberation Front in Algeria that beats France is a nationalist organization and in some ways a legitimate one. But we also know they were practitioners of terrorism in the worst way, introducing plastique bombings into public places and such. They won. They won. And they won, and their FLN party held sway in the parliament in Algiers for another couple of decades. And there's a lot of other groups that have won too, like the Khmer Rouge. And so this is a pressing threat strategically, but also at lower levels. It seems to me there's too often going to be people who've seen some of those models and want to do that. They think it works. And in many respects, it has worked. So we have to continue to push back in a moderate way and a professional way, well informed by art and science, and backed up by willpower, because after all, terrorism is in many respects a test of our wills.
All right. Well, I think all of you have realized, probably by virtue of you coming to this, that this is an issue that has not gone away. I would love to say that our President, Mr. Obama, was correct when he said, we can't be at war forever. We just got to end this thing. I wish that were the way the world worked. But, Mr. President, I'm sorry. Both sides have to stop in a war. And unfortunately, as Chris has discussed today, the other side hasn't decided to stop yet. So that means we need to stay involved as well. I'd ask you to join me in thanking Chris for a great presentation. And he is going to stay up here for a little while to sign any books, so anyone who's purchased one outside can bring it up, and he'd be happy to sign it. Thank you very much for being here at Heritage with us.
America's Security Affairs. Immediately prior to joining us here, Dr. Bucci was a lead consultant to IBM on cybersecurity. He also serves as an adjunct professor of leadership at George Mason University. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Steve Bucci. Steve?
Well, let me add my welcome to everyone here. This is a subject that's sort of near and dear to my heart. As a Special Forces officer, we focused a lot on terrorism and countering terrorism in my career. We have a rare treat today. I would add that on September 12th, 2001, there weren't that many people in America who were asking the question of, should we be fighting terrorism? Because the decision had sort of been made for us. It's been quite a while since then, for some of us longer than others. But today, there are lots of people asking questions, sort of the nature of a democracy as we approach conflict. The questions of who should we be fighting, why should we be fighting them, how should we address.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and to our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. I'll remind our Internet viewers that questions or comments can be sent to us at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. For those in-house, if you'll be so kind to make that last courtesy check that your cell phones are off, it is always appreciated by our speakers. And we, of course, will post the program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference as well. Hosting our discussion this afternoon is Stephen Bucci. Mr. Bucci is director of our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy. He previously served as a senior research fellow for Defense and Homeland Security here. Dr. Bucci also served for 3 decades as an Army Special Forces officer and top Pentagon official. He is well versed in special operations, cybersecurity, and defense support to civilian authorities. He served as military assistant to Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld for 5.5 years. Upon retirement from the Army, he continued at the Pentagon as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, Homeland Defense, and American.
For coming on such a chilly day, and I'm delighted to present perhaps 25 or 30 minutes of comments and look forward to interaction with you then on the questions you have. I'm also very glad to see Jim Phillips here. I've worked on terrorism issues with Jim for, it must be a quarter century now, and there are very few people in the world who write with the intelligence and prudence that Jim Phillips does. Here's a couple of reasons why I wanted to write the book, so I'll start this way with the way terrorism encounters the citizen. I remember back in 1980 reading some clippings in newspapers. It was in the Chicago area, and a woman was looking out her window near her home, and she saw a van pull up. And in that van, there proved to be some 9 different people, and they looked rather like an athletics team. You know, the jogging uniforms and the bags. But as she looked out her window, this lady, Mrs. Walter Jacobson, decided that she should be a little nervous about this. There had been some robberies in the area by the FALN, who were Puerto Rico.
Address this threat? How long are we going to have to put up with it? Chris Harmon has attempted in this book to answer some of those questions. I think it's timely. He does it in a way that, and this is not a criticism, this is actually a compliment, he does it in a way that does not obfuscate the questions and their answers with lots of academic window dressing. So he writes it in a way that is easily understandable by all of us, normal American citizens, and I hope that will be read by lots of those normal American citizens who live and work in that funny round-shaped building up the hill from Heritage, up there on the Capitol, because they really need to understand these things. Chris is the Matthew C. Horner Chair of Military Theory at the Marine Corps University. He is speaking today as an independent scholar and is not representing the Marine Corps. He is the author of, so far, 5 books related to terrorism. 2 editions of the book Terrorism Today, which is a graduate-level textbook used by many of the military schools, in particular around DOD. He has another one in the works, he tells me, that he's working on. He also has a relationship back to Heritage. We always like to talk about our alumni. And that he originally, in 2004, wrote a backgrounder. This is our somewhat longer pieces that we publish here at Heritage, that was called How Al-Qaeda May End. It was published in May of 2004 and was really one of the first publications post 9/11 to think about what the heck is going to happen to Al-Qaeda. I can tell you what I was thinking, what I was hoping would happen to Al-Qaeda in 2004, and it hasn't happened yet. So I am going to stop there, taking up time, and ask you to join me in welcoming Chris Harmon as he discusses with us his book, A Citizen's Guide to Terrorism and Counterterrorism, and then when he's done, I'll come back up to moderate the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you for